Food is fuel for your body, your mind, and definitely your sport. But let's face it, nutrition is confusing, and the expectations on girls and women to be thin and have a six-pack are exhausting. If you've ever been frustrated with your body, confused about nutrition, obsessed with eating healthy, or guilty when you don't, underate, overate, or overtrained, and overwhelmed with all the pressure, then this podcast is for you. Nutrition can be easy, you can take control of it, but it might start with letting go of control by asking for help and making a change. I'm Lindsay Elizabeth Cortez, sports dietitian and owner of Rise Up Nutrition, where I empower female athletes to overcome nutrition concerns and perform at their highest level, to stop being confused by all the mixed or harmful messages, and finally have confidence in your body as a fierce, fit, and fueled female athlete. Hey fans, Lindsay Elizabeth Cortez, registered sports dietitian and your host of the podcast. Our guest today is Melissa Lodge. She is a health sciences doctoral student, REDS researcher, elite runner, and a research collaborator at the Wu Tsai Female Athlete Program of Boston Children's Hospital. Her research focuses on female athlete physiology, particularly under conditions of low energy availability, such as relative energy deficiency in sport, and its associated impact on health and performance across the lifespan. She has presented her work at several regional, national, and international conferences featuring work in female athletes on low energy availability outcomes. Melissa is interested in exploring intervention-based models such as psychoeducation to improve outcomes for female athletes and girls in sports in the future. Melissa runs an educational platform at Fed_Collaborative, where she provides translational research on female athlete physiology, low energy availability, REDS, eating disorders, and disordered eating. I highly encourage you to give her a follow on her social media platforms and Fed Collaborative. She's got some great posts and videos to just explain some research that's coming out along these topics. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to remind you that the Female Athlete Nutrition Podcast.com website is officially launched. No, it's not perfect. I know there are lots of glitches still. I am working on them, but it's up. It's live, which means that you can now reach out if you want to be a guest or have a guest suggestion for our show. You can now head to femaleathletepodcast.com and be sure to reach out and fill out our application. You can also search for an episode that you want to listen to, sign up for our email list to be updated when our courses drop, and of course, you can easily hit that support button so that you can provide a financial contribution to keep this podcast going with free information, life-changing and life-saving information for female athletes to fuel and nourish their bodies to become fierce, fit, and fueled. Please check out femaleathletenutritionpodcast.com. And trust me that with a little bit more time, I'll fix all those kinks. I promise. Let's get to our conversation with Melissa. Melissa, thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation with our listeners today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to dive into some of the topics that we have planned.
For sure. You are somebody who's currently getting their PhD and actively researching the topics of REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, female athlete triad, disordered eating in female athletes specifically. So as you're researching it, I would just love to kind of hear your personal story. Like, why is this topic of interest to you? Why is this something that you're like, I want to explore this further as my career and my research?
Such a good question. Yeah. We throw around this idea a lot that research is me search, and that definitely is true for myself as well. These were some things that I struggled with growing up in the sport of running primarily. I played soccer, and then really once I got into high school, focused on running and started to really struggle with some of these conditions. Some of these psychological components were really overlapping in my own life. And so I sought clinical help, and a lot of that was actually through some of my more objective injuries. So like my bone stress injuries and not so much the psychological piece yet. And then I was lucky enough to grow up and live outside of Boston. So I was referred to the sports medicine division at Boston Children's Hospital. And that's where the female athlete program was getting started. And Dr. Catherine Ackerman, who's now a mentor of mine and a collaborator of mine, was my physician. And so she started putting these pieces together before I did. She was recognizing all of these signs and symptoms and risk factors that I was displaying. And she really educated me on some of these concepts that still felt a little bit maybe not so, how do I want to say, like they didn't feel like they explained me at the time, but now looking back, I know that they do. And so I think sometimes it takes us a little bit longer when you're going through something personally to recognize it in yourself. And so luckily, she was able to string that along for me. And through that process, really inspired me to answer these questions and help find answers to things that we didn't know, because I was a lot more true to the experience that I was having. There wasn't a lot of clinical recommendations or other physicians or teams that were able to treat patients like she was able to. And unfortunately, that's still kind of the case.
Yeah.
So working now on the other side to provide those answers and help build those multidisciplinary teams for athletes to go to get that same experience that I did to help further their health and performance. So kind of a long-winded way to say, I struggled with these things and I wanted to help kind of fill those gaps and answer questions that had yet to be answered in this space to help improve the outcomes for female athletes in the future.
Why did you feel at the time that you were getting help, recognizing that, okay, I'm having these bone injuries as a female athlete, maybe the problem here is nutrition, lack of fuel, lack of energy availability kind of is part of your story, but you didn't feel that described you. I was wondering if you could just expand upon that. Where was that disconnect of, hey, physician, doctor is telling me this, but it just doesn't feel like that's me?
Yeah, I think that those who are maybe that have some of this psychological overlap will relate to this idea that you think, okay, well, that's all well and good, but that's not me, right? Like I'm the exception to the rule. Like I can do this and find a way to skirt around my physiology, or I can work against it and it won't hurt me the same way that it will hurt somebody else. Like I was being fed the right messages actually. And I was interested at the time in educating myself on these topics. So it wasn't that I was actually misinformed. It was that I was getting informed with in being armed with the right information, but I just had that mentality that I could override those cues, those symptoms. And I think a lot of that was kind of the way that I was approaching things mentally, that I wasn't ready to seek help. Like I thought that help sounded really scary. And so that's something that I try to work with athletes now on is like, how can we demystify seeking treatment? We don't necessarily need to stop altogether. It doesn't need to be this big, scary thing. It can be baby steps if we're in a place where that's appropriate. It might also need to be a big overhaul, but sometimes it doesn't need to get there. And so I try to get athletes to recognize, okay, if I do the little things along the way, then maybe I don't need to take this big, scary step back. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately for me, like a lot of those seemingly big, scary step backs were a result of all of the bone stress injuries. So it wasn't that I had a choice, unfortunately, at that time. And I think a lot of athletes sometimes don't seek help until there is something objectively wrong.
Yeah.
And so I think that getting that support, we always say that like this is echoed in the disordered eating space a lot, where people will think that they're not bad enough. And I'm using that in air quotes. Yes. To say that their symptoms aren't bad enough or their behaviors aren't as bad as they've heard be described before or that are in the diagnostic manual. So I think there's some of that overlap in the REDS and low energy availability space where some people just think, it's not bad enough, or I'm probably doing okay. Mm-hmm. And so they don't seek that one-on-one help. And I really think that the sooner that you seek that one-on-one help, the more tools you have in your toolbox to navigate changes in your training, changes in your dietary intake, in finding ways to get ahead of the problem rather than, having something come up and having to play catch up or taking those big steps back and time away from training. We can hopefully do some things in the interim before it even gets that bad. But I think unfortunately athletes have really seen that people have gone the other way where, they have to take a big step back because they didn't pay attention to the little things.
Yeah.
And those stories are they're louder.
Yeah.
They're more in your face. They're more apparent. So really doing some work there to find ways that we can encourage athletes to seek help, even if they're not presenting with the worst case scenario, right? Like we can do a lot before then.
So thank you for sharing all of that and just, your own personal realization that you thought, okay, I'm educated on this stuff, but that's not me. I can still do this my way, or my body works differently. I resonate with that so much. And as a sports dietitian who's specialized in helping female athletes overcome disordered eating, I think I don't have proof of this, but I think every single one of my clients has said that to me. They have some sort of reason to believe in their own head that my body can't possibly need that many calories, or my body, can't possibly weigh X amount, or my body definitely will store fat with that many carbs. And I'll, I don't know. They just think that their body is different. And
right.
I can't tell you how many times I've told a client, I'm like, okay, Sarah, Megan, Cameron, insert name. You are unique and one in a million in many ways, but in this way you are not. Eat more carbs, you will perform better.
Yeah.
Get your fix your nutrition, the bone injuries will stop. It's hard.
Yeah. Where you're you are special, but in this respect, we cannot override some of our physiology. And I was grateful that my body was always not very resilient. And I think that helped me because my body would break down before I could, do anything quote unquote worse or what have you. And so, while I'm not happy that I ended up in the place that I did with all the bone stress injuries that I did, it did appear to be a very important indicator for me. Something is going wrong. You missed the mark and now you have no choice but to take a step back. Yeah. And so it's no, your physiology is not different.
Right. And to your point before though, of if only we could start making changes for the better before things got so bad, right? To your point, you're okay, well, I did have these injuries, so it was proof. But there are other people who are struggling, with the wide range of symptoms that REDS can show itself in. But because they don't have the missing period, or because they don't have the bone injury, that big red flag, they keep trying to make that excuse for themselves that this can't possibly be me. Or, they think with REDS, maybe this has to do with weight and being sick thing. Well, that can't be me because I've actually gained weight recently. And, we try and make these excuses that our body is going to be different. And I think that's why we just need so much more research to understand and educate people about all the different ways that REDS can kind of show itself, the symptoms. Is there anything, well, I guess you kind of already said it, but I was going to ask you in your personal journey, anything that really helped you get out of that mindset and, submit to the reality of I need to fuel better and fix this and get out of REDS. You were educated, like you mentioned, the kind of the bigger injuries kind of solidified that for you. Is there anything else that really helped you change your mindset?
Yeah. And I think this is really important when working with athletes too, and illustrated well in the REDS model is I really latched on to some of those performance outcomes, right? Those were a carrot for me. And obviously as a result, you improve your health in concert with recovery and ideally improving your performance on the other side of it. But in college, I had 7 stress fractures from high school to college.
Wow.
And in college, I had 2 femoral neck stress fractures, which are considered high risk in the REDS model. And at that point in time, I had to take big steps back from training. And, watching my conference championships or the regional championships happen and being on the sidelines and thinking, well, while my performance wasn't suffering so greatly due to the REDS outcomes, how much better could it be if I truly recovered? And so I used that as my motivator to say, like, the more consistent I can be, and we do have data to back this up in the endurance world, is, the more consistent you can be with training, the less unplanned time off that you take, the better your performance will be. And so I was really able to use that as a tool for me in my recovery to say, like, I want to be the best athlete. And by doing these things and engaging in these behaviors, I'm not close to the best athlete that I could be because of that. And ever since then, my performance across all of the events that I've participated in has improved. My ability to tolerate training has improved. In all of these aspects where I've seen the performance benefit, but again, on the other side, I've hopefully, moved the needle in the direction towards optimal or adequate health as well. I've kind of like moved away from this problematic space and improved in both aspects, not just one. And so doing that together, I think, is really important. Is you can use the performance as the carrot, but we also want to make sure that we're checking in on those health markers and that we're not just leaving that out of the conversation. But I think performance can be a really big carrot for these high achieving athletes who are wanting to be successful. They've probably gotten to that space not for a lack of caring about their performance. They maybe stumbled there for reasons to misinformed reasons to help improve their performance. So that was really helpful for me. And I know that that's often the case for a lot of athletes who, really want to be successful, is use that performance as a carrot.
Yeah, I agree completely. I'm not currently taking new clients due to some life circumstances, but the program that I most recently was running for over 5 years and helping female athletes overcome disordered eating was using performance as the driver. You want to be faster, get stronger, make varsity, get that scholarship, hit a new PR, whatever it might be, become an All-American. Like, we're going to use nutrition strategies to improve your performance. As you're doing that, it does improve your health because you can't improve your performance without improving your health. And the nutrition tactics that improve performance, like, fueling up pre and post workout, recovery, reaching your energy availability goals, getting in enough protein and calcium, all of that improves your performance. It also improves your health. They go hand in hand. And so, but using that performance as a driver instead of markers of health, because I think this is where people who aren't, sports medicine doctors or have this background, maybe you're just your family, practitioner who's great at what they do, but who doesn't have that knowledge on female athletes or REDS, might just look at markers of health like BMI or weight or a standard 2,000 calorie diet and really mislead somebody into saying that you are healthy or unhealthy. They might look at your blood work and say, oh, your blood work's fine. And it's like, well, wait a second, but I've only had 3 periods this year. And, thyroid's a little bit off. It's not terrible. I don't need medication, but it's a little off. Those nuances that somebody, who really only is specializing in this would understand. And that's where I think instead of using our traditional markers of health, using markers of performance to guide us can be so helpful, even though it will improve health in the background. Does that make sense? Are we on the same page with that? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I love to use that example of, like, they go hand in hand. And I really like the idea of actually, like, using both of them as motivators, like improving them alongside of each other, because you can't have one without the other.
Mm-mm.
Maybe in the short term, you can skirt around some of those ideas or those behaviors, but not long term. And I think a lot of the times too is it's really hard sometimes to convince athletes when they are performing well that they could be performing even better
Yeah.
if they focus on those things. So sometimes you do see the performance dip, but sometimes you see the behaviors are shifting and the performance hasn't quite dropped off as a result. And so that discussion can be a little bit more challenging. But again, it's what could be,
Yeah.
it could be better.
Yeah.
And as a result, your performance, you might not be dissatisfied, but you can still use it as a motivator. Like, don't you want to improve even more?
Right.
And we can do that by making these small changes. Hopefully small changes, maybe bigger changes, depending on the individual, but all of that's going to help performance and health as well.
And I love how you mentioned that, this discussion can be challenging and, performance should improve as health is improving. Sometimes there's a dip and that discussion is challenging. And that lays out the point right there that you need to be having that discussion. You need to be having somebody help you with this, maybe weekly, maybe monthly, because it's really hard to do on your own. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to kind of circle back to, kind of your role in research. You are helping conduct research at the WUSI Female Athlete Program at Boston Children's Hospital, which is also where you received help back then. And I was just wondering if you could sort of speak on the behalf of that program for a moment. Just give us a little background. What sort of services does this program help with? What type of staffing do they have? Just for and is it just local for people in the Boston area, huge city? So, and I'm actually from New England myself, and I've had clients, from Vermont that will drive down to Boston Children's Hospital because it's, but yeah, just tell us a little bit more about the program, I suppose.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, I was a patient when they were early goings before they even really had the stamp of the female athlete program on their door, let's say. And so I was really lucky just growing up there. And now they're obviously becoming recognized across the country, even across the globe, for all of the good work that they're doing on behalf of female athletes. And it's kind of special. And I'm lucky to have this kind of full circle moment to have been a patient and to now be on the other side and working in collaboration with Dr. Ackerman and her team. So I'm a PhD student, so my work goes through my home institution, but I'm lucky enough to, with research, obviously, there's a lot of people involved and there's a lot of collaboration that occurs across institutions, across across the globe, right? So I'm lucky that I have that in my arsenal, right? That I have that expertise to tap into. And as far as they have like their research and their clinical practice. Okay. So as far as research, that's kind of my involvement, and they work with wonderful researchers, others that you've had on the podcast, like Louise Burke, and then others that if you haven't had on, you should, like Trent Stellingworth and Margot Montjoy, all of these wonderful REDS researchers that exist in other countries and across the globe. So they do a lot of collaboration. Research is a big undertaking. And so having these teams of people who can work in concert with one another is so important, and it really helps advance the field. So that's kind of the research side of things in summary. And then as far as their clinical practice, they really, pulled it together, piecemealed it together, and it's now this kind of one-stop shop. We talk about the multidisciplinary team a lot in the REDS research and eating disordered eating space. And so it's defined a little bit differently, probably, whoever you talk to, but essentially it consists of this physician, a mental health specialist, a sports dietitian, all of these people that are on the healthcare team, and they're all housed within the female athlete program. So I've had the joy of working alongside their dietitians, their mental health specialists, whether it's, psychologists, psychiatrists. Dr. Ackerman runs the program as the medical doctor and has trained other medical doctors and other physician's assistants to work alongside of her. So all of these individuals can really help improve the clinical care of the athlete. And so they're in Boston Children's Hospital too, but I will say, like, I was a patient when I was a college student. So they really specialize in the female athlete, and there's very few clinical programs that do that. And so, you also mentioned, like, uh, if you're looking to seek treatment, I'm local, so it's also really nice to be able to refer to them because I don't have that clinical expertise, right? And so when somebody really needs that one-on-one care, I'm like, oh, well, go schedule an appointment, and it makes it easy for me. So I'm grateful for that. But then it's really challenging to establish these teams of people that have this expertise, that are trained in this way, not only trained in REDS, but trained in the female athlete. And so a lot of people that aren't local or are able to access these services are often, maybe piecemealing their multidisciplinary team together.
Right.
And so it's not impossible. And you could also, I don't know, like, I think that you would know more than I do about the licensing of sports dietitians, but I know that I refer a lot of individuals to sports dietitians who might not live in that exact area, but are licensed by that state.
You can be, yeah.
And so you can receive that virtual care. That's super helpful. And I don't know if mental health specialists, it probably depends on your credential, but have like a similar practice where you can see them virtually. If that's something that you want to see this one person, but you're maybe not local, that's always a good option. I think that that's becoming, a little bit more common to have a license in other states so that you can treat patients across state lines. And so sometimes that does require you to piece those people together. But the female athlete program has been a really strong example of how we could set those programs up and what they could look like in other areas, of the country, and other people across the world are looking to do this, right? And so it just really helps from not only having the expertise, but just being a patient and not necessarily knowing like all of the moving pieces. Having it all in one place is like
so nice,
so wonderful, right?
It is,
so
yeah. I think that
it's a wonderul program. If you're
Sorry, a little delay there. I didn't mean to cut you off. But
no.
What I was going to say is I think what's great about the program is it's the clinical services all in one place, multidisciplinary team and approach, like you said, for the female athlete that needs it. But it's also got that huge, okay, we're actively doing the research, collaborating with the best of the best in the field, globally, nationwide. So they're really progressing the field as they're also helping the client or the patient at the same time.
Yes, totally. And I think that that's such an important thing that we can all mirror in our research is asking the questions that people need answered.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great work that happens and a lot of questions that get answered that once you get the answer, you're looking around being like, all right, well, what do we do with this information? But I really love the field that I'm in because it's so practical and we're looking for answers for athletes who are going to implement what we find.
Yeah.
And so I think when you talk to the clinicians, when you talk to the coaches, when you talk to the athletes, you're able to get a better understanding of what challenges they're facing, what things they're seeing, and what problems need answers and what is maybe more of a priority. You could have a really well-intended and well thought out research question, but if it's not going to lead to anything that is meaningful or any practical application, I struggle with that. And so I think being an athlete myself, it's always helped my lens. And if you don't have that, and something that I still do, right, is because I'm just one person, is you kind of want to understand not only what information we currently have, but what gaps need to be filled in order to answer the questions that people want to improve their health, improve their performance. That's going to make the most meaningful change. And so when you kind of have all of that, that's why collaboration is so beautiful and so necessary, is because we need to think about it from all different angles and we need input from all different angles to understand what we want to ask, how we want to ask it, and then what that means, once we answer it. So all of those things are really important.
So I'm going to totally put you on the spot right now. What are some of the gaps like that what are the questions that you have right now, or that people you've spoken to in this field are just like, we need an answer for this? Like, what are some of the questions that you have right now?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones that I have is we've done a lot of groundwork to understand the outcomes of RED-S, the prevalence of RED-S, but we really need answers on what to do. It's not going to be the same for every athlete. And so really trying to figure out like how we can identify what resources are most valuable for which people, and getting the support staff on board, educating the coaches, the athletic trainers, the multidisciplinary team where, obviously, like I just mentioned, there's very few multidisciplinary teams out there that are doing this work. And so my desire is to really improve the outcomes for our female athletes and make sure that they're not only getting the treatment that they need, but we're getting ahead of some of these problems before they happen, because now we have enough research to suggest, hey, look, we need to spend time here. We need to understand how we can actually improve these outcomes, how we can reduce the risk. And then a lot of that too also stems from this fact that there's obviously a lot more interest in women's sports and female athlete physiology. And so do we need different recommendations? I think sometimes we jump to conclusions about that. While we do know that men and women are physiologically different, it doesn't necessarily mean that some of the recommendations need to be different. So I think our first question always needs to be like, does it need to be different? And then if yes, how? And so I think that there's a lot of that in sports nutrition, right? Is this idea of, well, the recommendations that we have when we think about, chronic or acute carbohydrate intake were done on primarily male samples. And obviously that's frustrating and there's some work to be done there. But I think instead of asking what are carbohydrate recommendations that are needed for the female athlete, we take the recommendations that we have from the male athlete and ask, do they need to be different? Mm-hmm. Are we seeing that there are different outcomes when we apply these recommendations to women? And if we're not, then we can kind of use that as our barometer. But to go in thinking that we need to find a different answer is a lot different than asking, do we need to find that answer first?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's, a great way to look at things, because as you mentioned, I feel, and this is probably thanks to the rapid spread of information via social media, we've had this huge wave of people waking up and realizing women are not men. Women have, different physiologies. We train differently. We hit puberty differently. We go through menopause differently. We go through pregnancy and childbirth. Like, all of this is different. Therefore, our health needs may be different as well. And so we've woken up to that. So I'm so glad that we've woken up to that. But it doesn't mean that everything about it is drastically different. And so there's been a lot, like you mentioned, on social media about women are different than men. It's like, well, yes, but it doesn't mean that we have to eat wildly differently. We don't know. We don't know yet. We're still researching that. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things I wanted to chat with you about today, and isn't necessarily something that you've specifically done a research study on yourself, but of course, just you're constantly researching all of this, is just like, do we need to change our nutrition throughout our menstrual cycle? I felt like there was a big wave of like, your nutrition needs change with your menstrual cycle. And now we're kind of backing off from that and being like, maybe it's, maybe we don't really have to. And I would just love to kind of hear in what you've read and researched and kind of what that is looking like right now. What do we know about our nutrition needs throughout our menstrual cycle, and if it needs to change or not?
Right. Yeah. So I think that this is a really important discussion to have, especially given the increased awareness and attention to the female athlete, to women's bodies, which totally echo what you're saying. It's really needed, and it's exciting to see the tides shift. But I think that it is important not to get ahead of ourselves. And so this idea around the menstrual cycle and all of the things that researchers are looking into with injury risk, recovery, performance, like all of these things are needed and should be further investigated. But we're really in the infancy of understanding what these outcomes are. And so from a sports nutrition or nutrition recommendation standpoint, we really don't have strong evidence yet to suggest that we need to adjust our training or our nutrition around the menstrual cycle. And I also would like to take this opportunity to highlight something that I often try to call attention to, which is when we're talking about the menstrual cycle, we are talking about half of the female athlete population.
Right.
Just about half of our female athletes are on some form of hormonal birth control. And so when we call this out, I think that's also important because those athletes sometimes on birth control are asking for questions to be answered around the menstrual cycle. And it kind of makes me curious about whether or not they know that once we answer the menstrual cycle question, you also have to answer
their question
for birth control.
Yep.
Right. And so I think that it sounds interesting and it sounds obviously like an area that needs more research and attention, but we've really gotten ahead of ourselves in some of the menstrual cycle tracking apps or just either influencers or athletes online kind of taking their experience and running with it to say that you potentially need to eat the way that they ate or train the way that they ate during these different phases, right? And so it's not really phase-based recommendations that we have. There's some strategies around carbohydrate intake because gluconeogenesis shifts potentially from the early evidence that we have. But it's not to say that we have, when we look at, when you pull up your sports nutrition textbook and you look at the recommendations, you don't have a male versus female column. And I think that that's what is really important for me to call attention to is that we potentially need that, but we don't even know. And so by getting ahead of ourselves, we're really doing ourselves a disservice by saying, if we are perpetuating that message online, I want it to come from a place of, and I don't think there's malice, right? No. I think that people are interested in answering this question and they want answers, but I think they've kind of skipped to the answer without asking the question. And that's where we really need to have pause.
Yeah.
Because I also want that question answered and we just don't know yet.
Yeah.
And so by telling athletes, and my concern again, coming from the low energy availability and red spaces, we want to be really careful about recommendations and things that we're telling athletes to do with their training and nutrition, because it can have really grave impact on them, either psychologically or physiologically. And that's not to say that we're going to maybe have these wildly different recommendations that we're telling athletes to completely reinvent the wheel. But I think it's really important to stay mindful because of the way that some athletes really treat some of these recommendations, and they hold them really closely and they treat them as the law, and that can be really damaging. So I think providing a framework for the question to be answered really sets the stage. And if we jump ahead of that, then we're not only having to myth bust in the process, but it's taking time away from the people who could really be answering that question from a research lens that has the evidence basis that we need to potentially make that recommendation. Or like I said at the top, potentially not. Right? That's where we always kind of that's where we have to start. And we have a framework. Unfortunately, it's a framework that has been done on primarily male samples. But now that we have the framework, let's not just throw that in the trash. Let's use that as a place to start and ask the question, does it need to be different?
Yeah. And I was recently diving into iron needs for female athletes. And I just think this is maybe a good example, right? If we're just thinking females are different than males. Females have monthly blood loss in which we lose iron. Also observationally, there's a lot of iron deficiency anemia in females. Then you can just kind of jump to the conclusion of throughout the menstrual cycle, women need more iron during their period because they're losing iron. But if you actually dig into the research, the female body also absorbs more iron during that time period. It's the body's smart enough to already know how to fix this potential problem. So it's actually not a problem, right? And I'm just using that as an example that just because, X, Y, and Z exists throughout the menstrual cycle, just because there's higher estrogen level does not mean that we immediately have to manipulate our diet for it. Like you said, we don't know yet. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. I know myself as a practitioner, I kind of jumped on that bandwagon in the beginning because I was like, wow, this is so cool. But then in reality, in practice, it's like, well, are you a team sport athlete or an individual athlete? Are you in control of your food or are you eating out of dorms? It's like, and it's like, well, how do you feel? Yeah. Are you naturally cycling? Are you amenorrheic? Are you having an abnormal cycle? Are you on the pill? Are you on the IUD? So many different scenarios that there was no way I could just say, oh, you're in luteal phase, increase your protein, decrease. It's like, there was no way I could just flat out say that anymore. So I've really, as a practitioner, it came back to listening to my client and what they were going through. And then as an athlete myself, listening to my body. And, I'm just a recreational, non-competitive athlete right now. So it's like, oh, I'm extra sore and tired. Okay, take a rest day. So then does my nutrition needs change? Well, not really, but I don't have pre and post workout because I'm not training today, so I'm just listening to my body.
Right.
And, so anyways, those are just some examples of, how it's like, it's such cool science that we want to dive into, but also we're going to learn more about our female physiology and what, again, that iron example, what that taught me is, gosh darn, our bodies are so amazing already. They've already got this figured out. We don't know the answer yet, but our body already does. And it's already doing it. It's already fixing it for us.
I love that example. I love that example because it really does highlight and shine a light on how smart our bodies are.
Yeah.
And it's not always going to be perfect, right? But there are mechanisms in place where your body will respond.
Yeah.
And that's really what we see in REDS. I think sometimes we can reframe what's happening. And when you see there's down regulation of certain body systems, it's because your body is trying to preserve everything that it can that's absolutely essential. And so obviously we want to make sure that all of our body systems are operating and fully functional and they're being given the energy and fuel that they need. But I think the REDS model itself is just it's that in motion. It's showing your body's probably shutting down the menstrual cycle because it's not getting enough fuel. And look, that's not super essential right now. We need to keep you alive and we're going to downregulate your resting metabolic rate because you're not giving us enough fuel to do the processes that we want at this level. So we're going to learn how to do them with less and less fuel because the body is not providing it for us. And so I just think that the body is so smart and we can't always rely on it, right? There are some circumstances in which we need to intervene and do that work too. But they are so smart and it's doing everything that it can to help us, right? That's what the iron absorption is trying to do. It's saying, oh, we're losing more, so we need to find a way to increase this mechanism to get more in.
Right.
So yeah, I love that example. It just perfectly highlights how smart our bodies are.
Yeah. And to your point as well of how smart your body is, that it's trying to preserve you. It's fighting for its life. And I think so many people, if they are experiencing symptoms of REDS itself, you really can feel if you're walking in those shoes that your body is failing you, not working, rebelling against you. So many of my clients have just felt like their body is just broken. And if we can shift our mindset to almost I don't want to be I'm not proud of REDS in that sense of I'm not encouraging it, but it is, no. Even in this crappy situation, your body is fighting for you. I'm not happy that it's had to downregulate its metabolic rate, but I'm not happy that you had to lose your period, but your body's fighting for you to thrive, to survive. Give it credit. And I think that's where we can start that foundation of respecting your body, that
Mm-hmm.
it's not broken. It's not failing you. It is fighting for you. It is working for you. Now can you start working with it? Instead of you fighting against your body, work with it as well. And it might actually give you the result that you want as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I love this idea of working with it. And like we said earlier, unfortunately, like you're not that special in this area. Your body is not treating you any differently than it would treat somebody else to try to keep all of its systems on board. So work with it, not against it. And hopefully you'll find that there's room for the goals that you're looking to achieve by, the way that you're trying to go about it is really, let go of it a little bit and start working with your body instead.
And so on that note, we haven't even dug into your research yet. So let's chat about what I'm working with your body. Well, you put together with a team of people a great review article, The Considerations of Low Carb Availability to Reds and Female Athletes. This was such an eye-opening paper. I actually spoke about this and kind of dug into the details of it with another sports dietitian, Kelsey Pontious, on a previous episode. We kind of dug through some highlighting points there. But I just kind of wanted to hear from you as, that review article was being put together and just in your own experiences, like just this importance of low carb availability and its role in Reds. Again, as a practitioner, I found that too. Sometimes my clients are eating enough in the terms of energy availability, but they're getting all of their energy from fats and peanut butters and great. We love that. But I'm still like, why? You're still training at a high level and it's your carbs that you are missing. So just kind of love to hear your personal thoughts and professional thoughts on that.
Yeah, totally. So this review kind of came out of the idea that we were starting to see more and more that this carbohydrate intake needs to be considered alongside of the energy intake as a whole. And there's very little that's been done so far. And so I really hope to see this area grow. When we started to dive into the research, we realized, no, there's actually not a lot of it.
I know.
That tends to be the case, right, when we're dealing with our female athletes. But when we're looking at low energy availability intervention studies, and we're considering that if the energy is low, that has to come from somewhere. And when we look at our macronutrient recommendations, one, carbohydrates are the greatest proportion of the macronutrients, right? And so just by simple numbers, right, if you're going to take away from energy, then you're going to also take away, if you take away equally from all the macronutrients, you're going to take a lot away from carbohydrates. But we're also seeing that people are typically underfueling the carbohydrates more so than any other macronutrient.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons for that. There's some misinformation that plays into that, but there also seems to be a big fear of carbohydrates. And there's been a study that was done in like Australian rules football players that illustrated that I think it was like upwards of 70% of the athletes were afraid of carbohydrates in some way, shape, or form. And so it's really important, given the macronutrient intake recommendations, first of all. Second of all, the fact that people are afraid of this, right? And then we add on top of that we're looking in this paper, we were looking at endurance athletes who use carbohydrates as their primary source of fuel during exercise. And that's the case, honestly, across a lot of sports, but we're like particularly concerned with that carbohydrate intake need being so high in the endurance population, and that we're already undershooting when we're even looking at some of the lower recommendations for carbohydrates. So we found that a lot of athletes were underdoing it, right? So there was, I don't have it in front of me right this moment, but there was something to the effect of like 45 to 95% of the athletes, depending on the population that you looked at, were not meeting their carbohydrate recommendation, which is very concerning, right? And then on top of that, we're compounding the effect of energy availability. And so in low energy availability, we're getting these Reds outcomes. And if it's coming from the carbohydrate source, we're seeing that some of these responses are even worse. So we're kind of doubling down on something that's of concern already. And when we're looking at some of those studies, we're seeing things along the lines of immune response, bone health. These outcomes are further compounded because of the low carbohydrate intake.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really a lot more work that needs to be done there because the low energy availability and the low carbohydrate availability tend to occur together.
Right.
And so if we are seeing them together, we might not be fully representing whether or not it's the energy, whether or not it's the carbohydrates, or whether or not it's both, right? And so there's a lot more work to be done here. If people are interested, like we need more of these questions answered. But we are starting to see in the literature that's started to look at this, that it's becoming an issue that could be energy independent and or have a magnifying effect because of the carbohydrate intake.
Yeah. I mean, if carbs are low and you're eating enough protein and fat, theoretically the body can create those carbohydrates for you, but that's extra work on your body when you're already trying to heal and your body's already doing extra work. So yeah, because I think that's where the research needs to go. What if we have adequate energy availability, but still low carb? How does that now affect us?
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think just through my own anecdotal responses here based on all my clients throughout the years, we need those carbs for performance. We need them for health. I mean, I learned this in my textbooks, 15 years ago about the role of carbohydrates and B vitamins to prevent upper respiratory tract infections. And it's like, so sickness, immunosuppression, you need to eat your carbohydrates in order, to help your immune system. And I think our society just wants we just want to pinpoint, oh, you don't need that. I was listening to a completely unrelated podcast with my husband last night where literally somebody said, like, your body doesn't need carbs. And I was just like, took a deep breath. And I was just like, well, gosh, yeah. Our society just always wants to say, you don't need that. You don't need that. Or you need this instead. And, okay, well, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole if I start talking about that. It's so nuanced.
I know. Yeah. And that's the thing really is there's so many interactions that are happening. And so there's a lot more work to be done in order to understand, just what those interactions are. And like you said, we kind of know that the important role of some of these macronutrients, some of the micronutrients that have been well established.
Yeah.
But what becomes challenging is when you're in a state of low energy availability and we're already down regulating some of those body systems and there's impairment, what then is also happening behind the scenes that's so intrinsically tied and the processes are connected. And that's where it becomes really complex in order to think like, are we making a bad situation worse? Could we find ways to improve this situation by putting more carbohydrates on board? Do we need, for going back to what we were talking about earlier, do we need our recommendations to be different for our female athletes?
Yeah.
Does it need to be different at different points in the menstrual cycle or not? All of these questions are yet to be answered. And I think that's where I think I get frustrated with the oversimplification and like this over recommendation on either doing something or not doing something. We want to like push an agenda or like completely tear down years of work that have been done to show that carbohydrates are obviously important. And so it does feel funny in some ways, sad but funny that, we're making the case for carbohydrates still. And we're kind of fighting back against a lot of this work that's been done to show how beneficial they are. And now, we're on the flip side saying, okay, people are underdoing it and they're experiencing all of these poor outcomes as a result, not only to their health, but also their performance. And now we're trying to convince people again, like, you don't have to be afraid of your carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are your friend. They're going to fuel your performance. They're going to fuel your bones, your immune system, all of these things. But people are quick to cut things out and make rules for themselves, which is unfortunate. And so hopefully kind of tackling some of those behaviors and those psychological thoughts around food and in athletes' bodies, like hopefully all of these things can help work in unison
Yeah.
so that we're tackling it from all angles and making sure, again, that not every athlete's going to respond the same to interventions, to clinical care. And so we really need to find strategies that really work for different pockets of people and find ways that we can really move the needle forward in order to help improve an athlete's health or performance or protect them from developing these conditions that could lead to a lot of impairment to their body systems and then have performance suffer as a result. So it is kind of interesting how you really just that needle gets thread so finely, and all of a sudden we're having the same discussion that people were having years ago. And so really focusing that work on the female athlete in order to, really answer the question of how do we make this better for them and what recommendations we potentially need and what behaviors we need to correct as a result.
Well, Melissa, I hate to tell you this, but after this conversation, I just have 1,000 more questions that need answering. So I'm leaving this conversation with more questions, which I think is the sign of a good researcher who gets you thinking differently. And you're exactly who we need to keep, pushing this field, keep asking questions, although it's frustrating. That's what I'm frustrated now. I'm like,
I know.
I just want to know now. I want the answers now.
I know. Me too. Me too. I agree. And that's always like, I catch myself saying it depends a lot. And so, it's not always the most encouraging, but I think that it's important because it's really reflecting what we're seeing. And so we need those answers, and those answers will lead to more questions.
And it's helping pump the brakes. Yeah, it's helping pump the brakes in a society that wants all the answers now, thinks we have all the answers at our fingertips with AI and Google and web search. It's like we think we have all the answers, and we need educated people to be like, wait a second, we don't yet, and just kind of remind us of that. Though it's frustrating, and especially when you're in a situation like if you are somebody listening to this podcast because you're struggling with RED-S and you want to figure out how to fix it, we have lots of answers, but we don't have all of them. And so it's hard. But here, I'm going to throw some easy questions for you to answer as we wrap this up. You ready?
Yes, sounds good.
If there's one food you could eat every single day for the rest of your life and never get sick of it, what would it be?
Oof. I'm big on like overdoing certain things that snacks or foods that I like and then I eat too much, but I never get sick of ice cream.
How could
Can't overdo it.
How could you? Yeah.
Yeah.
What is your favorite sport to participate in?
Obviously running. Yeah, distance running. 1,500 miles, like my favorite event of all of them. So
love it. How about as a spectator? Is it still running, or is there another sport that you love watching and being a fan of?
Oh, good question. I mean, I do like watching it. I would encourage people to watch if they haven't. It is entertaining, but I'm a big women's soccer fan. It's so entertaining. I never get bored. I don't want to get up. I just can sit and watch the whole 90-minute plus game with no concerns. Yeah. It's so fun. I love women's soccer.
And if there's a female athlete out there that you want to give a shout out to, somebody well-known or just in your personal life for being a role model and inspiration, who would that be and why?
Oh, good question. Let's see. I'm going to might not be one particular person, but something that in my post-collegiate life has really inspired me in female athletes that I've observed is those that are willing to explore a different relationship with it. So I have one friend, Mary Malone, who I love that she just found a different way to engage in running and participate in it in a way that felt good for her, after college. And she didn't put pressure on it. And I've seen a lot more people do this. And so when people can step away and think about what was really important to them about running or whatever sport it is, what got them into it and keeps them excited, that's always really inspiring to me when you can kind of take that step back instead of just pushing and go, which is so common in the athletics world. So all of those people that are redefining their relationship with their sport after college it's really hard to do. And so I find that's really inspiring when I see people find a way to make it work for them.
I love that. And I'm going to go on a tangent. I'm going to try and keep it short. But just in the way that we're talking about how a lot of nutrition science was done on men, and we're now exploring what does this look like for women. When we think about the sports industry, that was the foundation is men's sports. And I feel like, we've mimicked women's sports to be like men's sports. And I think women are redefining that of, wait, I can engage and participate, or this is what an all women's team with a women's head coach or, women's clothing looks like. And we're really redefining that. So your friend Mary Malone redefined sport for her. And I think that the next generation of female athletes is going to be doing a lot of that. So that's.
Yes. I love that. Yeah, exactly.
So cool.
Thinking about it in different ways across all aspects of sport. It's really exciting to see. And, I'm excited for what future generations come up with and how they're better for it. I hope that's the case.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. This was a fun conversation, though. As I said, I'm a bit frustrated now. I just have more questions, but in due time, they shall be answered in due time. So Thank you so much. And we'll be sure. We didn't even have time to talk about it, but you have an Instagram handle. You have a personal one and another one called the Fed Collaborative. And we'll be sure to link that because you just, you have great educational posts, research, some videos of you talking, kind of explaining some research. So that's really, really helpful for people who want to follow and are interested in learning more of the science besides female athletes and the physiology and nutrition and training. So thank you so much, Melissa.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, everybody, thanks for listening. I really hope you enjoyed that episode. And if you did, if you are a true fan of female athlete nutrition, then I would love if you could support our podcast by spreading the word. Share a review on your listening channel, give us 5 stars. It really helps get the word out and get the show more views to positively impact others. Also, you can support the podcast by joining our Patreon. Head to patreon.com/femaleathletenutrition to consider a donation, or even better, join our membership where you get extra monthly content and perks. We don't want you to simply listen alone. We want you to be a part of a community and a movement of fierce, fit, and fueled female athletes. So patreon.com/femaleathletenutrition is where you can do exactly that, learn more, and join. A huge thanks to our affiliates and partners as well. Once again, Prevenix, Inside Tracker, Orgain, Practice Better, Jen and Carrie. Please go check them out, and their links in the show notes where you can get deals and discounts. Last, be sure that you do more than just listen. If you need help with fueling, it's time to take action. Head to my website to learn more. You can either book a free call with me to learn more about our coaching programs and how we can work directly with you, whether it's the fast track or otherwise. Or you can take our online self-studied course, Female Athlete Nutrition. You can literally sign up and gain access right now. You can explore our downloadable products, including the Red S Recovery Guide, High Iron Fueling Guide, or if you are a coach of a team, check out our brand new Coaches Toolkit for teams. You can also just learn more. We have a blog, a Red S quiz to see if Red S is affecting you. If you need help, I want you to get help fast. Too many girls and athletes struggle with nutrition, but you don't have to any longer. You can rise up with the power of nutrition, take action today in any of these avenues, and become fierce, fit, and fueled. Links in the show notes, and we'll see you next time.